I am grateful for the invitation of Tripp and Sarah to speak in this series on theology in a time of crisis. The crisis that drove this series online exploded into our lives in early March, ripping through our communities with devastating force, leaving a global trail of death and destruction. COVID-19 has stripped bare the injustices of our society, where Black and Brown people in high density neighborhoods have suffered the most, as usual. Every major city in the USA is a tinderbox of racial grievance and despair, trapped in America's legacy of racism extending to its founding. Now we are confronted with yet another Black man brutalized to death as though his life did not matter. The murder of George Floyd is another reminder that there is no vaccine on the way for anti-Black racism. We grieve for him and the many Black victims who preceded Mr. Floyd in very similar manner. Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, Laquan McDonald, Sandra Bland, Dominique Clayton, Botham Jean, Tatiana Jefferson, Ahmed Arbery, Breonna Taylor, so many others. We are bombarded with crises piled on each other and compounding each other. We have lived through crises that seemed world-shaking for a while and then passed. The Cold War, 9/11, the financial crash of 2008. Anti-Black racism and economic injustice are crises of another kind. Both are such fundamental and long-standing features of American society that it can seem paradoxical to even refer to them as crises. Today, I am going to linger over the crises of anti-Black racism and economic injustice that founded social gospel movements on both sides of the color line. But a crisis is a crisis, partly because it defies certainty, confident speaking, assurance, thinking that you know the answer. In 1910, W.E.B. Du Bois founded Crisis magazine as the flagship of the newly founded NAACP. He had no idea if he had any chance of succeeding. He quit his job at Atlanta University and dragged his family to New York with no guarantee of a salary. Du Bois had just failed crushingly in his previous venture, the Niagara Movement. Before that, the Afro-American Council had failed, and before that, the Afro-American League had failed. Founding the NAACP and its magazine were desperation moves for Du Bois. After World War I, when theologians began to hold conferences again, they repudiated the language of cultural progress that they learned in graduate school. Western civilization and modern thought were in crisis, they said. The first name of the dialectical theology movement that formed around Karl Barth was crisis theology. It was a reaction to the slaughter and destruction of World War I and the imperial hubris that produced it. Modern theology had sanctified the conceits of bourgeois culture. Crisis theology was about shattered illusions, the experience of emptiness before a hidden God, and what Barth called the unexpected surge of spiritual meaning that he found in the strange new world within the Bible. A new world enters our world by the grace of God's Spirit. Barth said that before the kingdom of God can become real to modern people, there must come a crisis that denies all human thought. Actually, you cannot write systematic theology on that basis. And Barth spent the next 12 years figuring out how to be a theologian. Crisis theology, he came to realize, was too infatuated with its own rhetoric of crisis and too eager to theologize it. But the saving truth in the rhetoric of crisis is that our knowledge is fallible, situated, and fragmented. We have no control over that which we need, grace and love divine. I do not know how to frame the multi-layered crisis of our time. This past February, I finished a big book on the history of American democratic socialism and sent it off to my publisher. It felt precarious to meet a publishing deadline just as Bernie Sanders seized the lead in the race for the Democratic nomination for president, but I took consolation that there would be room for a few editorial tweaks before the book went to press. Then the world changed with stunning, sweeping brutality. Italy was devastated, and in New York City, we wondered fearfully, will we be ravaged like Italy? Soon, New York was worse than Italy. COVID-19 overwhelmed New York hospitals and piled up bodies in makeshift morgues. It surged north, south, and west across the nation, worse than any other nation, exposing that the mighty USA was less prepared than any comparable society to handle the onslaught. The federal government did the minimum while President Trump sprayed his news conferences with a fire hose of lies and self-congratulation. State governors shut down their economies to flatten the curve of infection and save local hospitals from crashing. Black and brown Americans suffered the worst, while healthcare workers struggled heroically to save as many lives as possible. Then the governors began to reopen their economies before 98% of the US population had been tested even once. In April alone, the US economy lost 21 million jobs, a doubly disastrous figure for a nation that ties healthcare coverage to a job. Back in February, Sanders surged in the Democratic race while Joe Biden stumbled through the early primaries with a wan message about restoring political normalcy. 5 major candidates clogged the moderate lane, all of them warning that Sanders was too left-wing to defeat Trump. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Warren tried to find a lane between the 5 moderates and Sanders and failed. The field consolidated with breathtaking speed, narrowing to Biden versus Sanders, just as contagion fear swept the nation. Today, Joe Biden is pondering in his basement whether he dares to move left, as Franklin Roosevelt did in 1933. Meanwhile, Trump knows very well what works for him. The same divide and conquer racism and nationalism that put him in the White House. We are in one of those rare historical moments when systemic injustices are stripped bare for everyone to see. When such a moment occurs, new possibilities are suddenly realistic. Paul Tillich, in 1920, recycled a Greek word to name such a time as this: kairos. Kairos, the right time, named the post-war moment when new things were possible. Tillich and Barth developed highly creative socialist theologies. But today I'm going to steer mostly through the USA and England. In the USA, we have long debated 2 contrasting visions of what kind of country we want to be. The first is the vision of a society that provides unrestricted liberty to acquire wealth, lifts the right to property above the right to self-government, and protects the interests of established elites. This idea legitimizes the dominance of the wealthy, the aggressive, and the corporations in the name of individual freedom. The second is the vision of a realized democracy in which democratic self-government is superior to property and no group dominates any other. This idea extends the rights of political democracy into the social and economic spheres. The social gospel of the Gilded Age espoused the second vision. In the white churches, it was principally a response to industrialization and the corruption of the Gilded Age. The white social gospel put social justice on the agenda of the ecumenical churches, changing how these churches talked about salvation. It created the ecumenical movement and the field of social ethics. It recovered the social justice emphasis of Hebrew scripture and the centrality of the kingdom of God in the teaching of Jesus. It established and legitimized liberal theology in American Protestantism. It was the greatest wave of social justice activism ever generated by the ecumenical churches, and it was a species of Christian socialism. The social gospel that arose in Black churches was a struggle for a new abolitionism. It arose as a response to the abandonment of Reconstruction and an upsurge of racial terrorism. The Black social gospel enlisted the churches in the struggle for racial justice, helping to build protest organizations against Jim Crow. It paved the way to the civil rights movement, the greatest story we have in the USA, providing the social justice theology of the civil rights movement. Both of these social gospel traditions had democratic socialist flanks led by prominent figures. These Christian socialist movements were the wellsprings of every form of liberation theology, showing that struggles for economic justice and racial justice can fold together and must. W.D.P. Bliss, Vita Scudder, George Herron, Walter Rauschenbusch, and Walter Mulder were foremost among the white American Christian socialists. Reverdy Ransom, George W. Woodby, Mordecai Johnson, Benjamin Mays, Pauli Murray, and Martin Luther King Jr. were foremost among the Black American Christian socialists. I believe that political theology needs a better genealogy than the Carl Schmitt story it usually tells. It has an incomparably better one in the religious socialists who responded to the crises of their time by imagining a democratic socialist society that abolished anti-Black racism and all other forms of oppression. It was not a coincidence that the social gospel, social ethics, sociology, the social sciences, socialism, and the ideas of social structure, social salvation, and social justice all arose at the same time. Also, corporate capitalism, the trade unions, and the first organizations devoted to racial justice. The social gospel developed a novel doctrine of social salvation, which was based on the emerging sociological idea of social structure, which gave rise to the idea of social justice. The key to the social gospel was its claim that Christianity has a mission to transform the structures of society in the direction of social justice. Neither part of that sentence was even a possibility before the 1880s. Before the modern era, nobody knew there was such a thing as social structure. In the social gospel, society became a subject of redemption. Social justice became intrinsic to salvation. The church began to say that salvation must be personal and social to be saving. A bad society makes ordinary people do bad things. A good society makes selfish people less selfish and violent. There was a key difference between European Christian socialism and the American social gospel, and the difference was not socialism. Nearly the entire American movement supported producer cooperatives, economic democracy, and the socialization of natural monopolies, even as much of the movement avoided the S word. But the social gospel was an evangelical earthquake that should be called the Third Great Awakening. It proclaimed that America had fallen into miserable corruption and only a spiritual awakening would save America from its sins. Only the Black social gospel gave privilege to racial justice in the way that the logic of the social gospel demanded. And the part of the white social gospel that did give any sort of credence to giving priority to race was the one that tried to build ecumenical organizations. The middle-class ministers who founded the white social gospel burned with shame at being criticized by the Knights of Labor, a radical Christian industrial union with no color bar. The Knights arose in the 1870s and had almost 1 million members by 1886. They were predominantly Protestant until Catholics poured into the union in the mid-1880s. The Knights blasted the churches for siding with the ruling class, but they got pulled into too many strikes and they were violently suppressed by state militias. Then the Knights were surpassed by the American Federation of Labor, AFL, a federation of mostly conservative, racist, sexist craft unions that barred Black Americans, women, and entire categories of immigrants, especially Asians. The fall of the Knights deprived the social gospel of the kind of labor movement that it needed, especially one that privileged racial justice, that had no color bar, and that realized that socialism is for everybody. Meanwhile, the founders of the Black social gospel were compelled to ask what a new abolitionism would be. They were an embattled minority in their own denominations because the social gospel was divisive and it got people in trouble. The founders fought hard for the right to advocate progressive theology and social justice politics. To them, the crisis was the plague of white terrorism and disenfranchisement that began during Reconstruction. The founders were succeeded by a generation of leaders that espoused Black social gospel theology from the beginning of their careers. They were role models for King, who did not come from nowhere. King was steeped in a Black social gospel tradition that sang and preached and marched to redeem the USA. I have placed the two US American social gospels in the context of European Christian socialism and the abolitionist traditions and the ecumenical tradition, while noting that American social Christianity had a distinctly evangelical cast. The original idea of socialism goes back to the 1820s in France and England, where Charles Fourier and Robert Owen were the pioneers. The idea was to achieve the unrealized demands of the French Revolution, which never reached the working class. Instead of pitting workers against each other, a cooperative mode of production and exchange would allow them to work for each other. All the early traditions of socialism conceived it as producer cooperatives or cooperative guilds. Other kinds of socialism arose in the later 19th century. Radical democracy, a form of populism, Marxism, a theory of proletarian revolution, anarcho-syndicalism, a call for worker syndicates, Fabianism, a theory of democratic state collectivism, social democracy, a blend of Marxism and democratic state socialism, guild socialism, a blend of cooperative and syndical ideas. All these schools of thought blame capitalism for all of society's ills, but religious socialists did not. So there were Christian and Jewish versions of every socialist tradition, and some of them gave priority to racial injustice. No definition of socialism as economic collectivism or state control of the economy or any particular ownership scheme is common to the many traditions of socialist thought. Historically, Marxism played the leading role in reducing the idea of socialism to collective ownership, and Fabian socialism played the second leading role in a very different way. Karl Marx taught that the structure of economic ownership determines the character of an entire society, and socialism is the collective ownership of the means of production and exchange, a sufficient condition for fulfilling the essential aspirations of human beings. He developed the most powerful critique of capitalism ever conceived, inspiring numerous traditions of Marxian criticism. His focus on the factors of production and the structural capitalist tendency to generate crises of overproduction and crash made permanent contributions to socialist thought. But Marx's dogmatic determinism, catastrophe mentality, and doctrine of proletarian dictatorship caused immense harm. He developed his theory during an era in which democracy was merely a form of government and thus of low importance to him. His denigration of ethical reason obscured his own ethical wellspring. And his fixation on collective ownership relegated anti-racism, feminism, and all other reform causes to secondary status at best. Every kind of socialism retains the original idea of organizing society as a cooperative community. Yet there is no core that unites the many schools of socialism or democratic socialism. To say democratic socialism is to self-consciously register something fateful about the history of socialism. 19th century British socialists did not call themselves democratic socialists, even though most of them were, because democracy was not controversial or divisive in British socialism. Democracy was controversial in continental Marxism, where Marxists contended that existing democracy was a bourgeois fraud, and real democracy would emerge only from a proletarian revolution, after which there would be no need of a state. For a socialist to lionize democracy as the best road to socialism was ridiculous. Democracy would come by making the state irrelevant, as Marxists believed, or by smashing the state, as anarchists believed. Democratic socialists refused to subordinate democracy and its reform causes to a catastrophe vision of deliverance or the demands of a left-wing dictatorship. They said socialists had to be resolutely democratic and liberal on their way to achieving socialism, and not merely on tactical grounds. Edward Bernstein made the classic case for this position in 1899 in the German Social Democratic Party, SPD. He rocked the SPD by doing so, which sealed the break between its orthodox Marxist wing and its democratic socialist wing. The terms democratic socialist and revisionist have been linked ever since. But revisionism is a necessary enterprise in every intellectual tradition, naming the willingness to revise a stagnant orthodoxy. After World War I, when democratic socialists began to win elections and serve in coalition governments, a gap opened up between democratic socialism and what was called social democracy. Democratic socialism was still a vision of democratic self-determination in every sphere of society. But social democracy now became what democratic socialists achieved when they attained power, creating more generous and humane forms of capitalism. In my book, Social Democracy in the Making, I analyze the European history of this logic. Today, every social democratic party in the world is struggling to rethink its mission in the face of economic globalization and backlash movements based on racism and xenophobia. In Germany, the SPD has capitulated to neoliberalism and become habituated to its junior partner alliance with the Conservative Party. In Sweden, the Social Democratic Party has disavowed its historic attempt to democratize major enterprises, the Meidner Plan. But Germany has co-determined enterprises. free education, and universal health care. And Sweden, Denmark, and Norway have universal health care, high wages, strong unions, free education, monthly stipends to undergraduates, 480 days of paid parental leave, and until the pandemic, vibrant economies that are 1/4 publicly owned. The richest tradition of Christian socialism is the British one. It goes back to the 1840s, founded by the iconic Anglican trio of Frederick Denison Morris, John Ludlow, and Charles Kingsley. Morris argued that cooperation is the moral law of the divine order. Socialism reflects the divine order by creating a cooperative society. Ideologically, the first Christian socialists were in the cooperative tradition of Robert Owen, sometimes with a French inflection. Fatefully, they clashed with each other over consumer cooperatives, state financing for producer cooperatives, and cooperative syndicates. Is socialism only about the mode of production? Do we want the state to finance cooperatives? Shouldn't socialism be less divisive than capitalism? These questions thwarted the first wave of Christian socialism. The mighty second wave, which began in the 1880s, was mostly Anglo-Catholic. Many Anglican socialists were stubbornly cooperative in the Owen and Morris mode. Some joined the Fabian movement after it arose in 1884. Some joined the social union reformers who came out of Oxford. Some gave highest priority to socializing land. A great many joined the Workers' Party movement after it arose in 1893. And some became leaders of the Guild Socialist movement. But Christian socialism had an ethical wellspring that qualified its commitment to these ideologies. Christian socialists were committed to an ethic of equality, freedom, and cooperative community. They denied that a Fabian or syndical or social unionist or Marxist ideology was more binding than their ethical convictions. England had deep traditions of Christian and ethical socialism long before it acquired a Workers' Party or a Marxist tradition. In 1893, a Christian socialist labor leader, Keir Hardie, founded the Independent Labour Party, ILP, which compelled many socialists to make an excruciating decision. Should they stay in the radical wing of the Liberal Party or join the party of actual workers? A workers' party might be a disaster for anti-imperialism and anti-racism. Joining the ILP might destroy the anti-imperialist wing of the Liberal Party. And it might hand the government to the Tories, which, in fact, it did. Leading Christian socialists replied that they had to be with the workers and convert them to anti-imperialism, anti-racism, and anti-militarism. Meanwhile, the Fabian Society became an activist powerhouse led by sociologist Sidney Webb, his partner Beatrice Webb, and literary star George Bernard Shaw. They said, British socialism did not need Karl Marx's glorification of revolutionary violence or any of his exotic doctrines. All it needed was to proceed on its present course. The reach of government grew every year. This process was relentless, beneficial, and civilizing. It tamed the predatory impulses of capitalism, making society rational. Soon the flow of progress would civilize England and the entire world. All good liberals, progressives, ethical socialists, radical Democrats, and radical Tories of the late Victorian era believed that the world was progressing toward higher forms of civilization and democracy. Even Marxists held a version of this belief in progress. The Fabians turned this belief into an argument for bureaucratic state collectivism. Socialism was government ownership directed by elite managers, that is, Fabians, some of whom had very shabby views about patriotism and racism, and even a couple of them, eugenics. But Christian socialists fit their ideology to their ethical convictions, not the other way around. Even those who joined the Fabian Society fought for the ethical difference when it arose. It arose repeatedly over imperialism and racism. Britons were schooled in the lore of the British Empire, a tale of mercantile colonization under the Stuarts and Cromwell, war victories against the Dutch, French, and Spanish in the 17th century, the acquisition of Eastern North America, the St. Lawrence Basin in Canada, numerous territories in the Caribbean, slave trading outposts in Africa, commercial interests in India, and Disraeli's incursions of the 1870s into Egypt, India, Afghanistan, and South Africa. In the 1880s, John Hobson said, a new kind of imperialism was emerging that had to be opposed differently than the old kind. It was no longer enough just to conceive imperialism as a problem of power lust and overreaching nationalism and military overreach. Hobson said the new imperialism is driven by fierce economic competition for new markets. He wrote about this historical turn as it occurred, publishing 10 books before he wrote his famous book, Imperialism, in 1902, contending that modern capitalism is unsustainable without exploiting colonized markets. Christian socialists, Charles Marson, Conrad Knoll, Scott Holland, and Charles Gore blasted the new imperialism, especially the Boer War and the plunder of Africa. They were strong anti-imperialists because their deepest convictions were ethical religious, and they lived in the belly of the beast. They had a deep loathing of the patriotic racism they were taught in school. Some of them made bishop anyway, notably Gore, because that was England too. Foremost among the Christian socialist bishops was William Temple. Temple was a neo-Hegelian theologian, a theorist of economic democracy, spiritually deep and eloquent. When I was 28 years old, his books lured me into the Episcopal Church. In my 20s, I was a solidarity organizer. At 30, I became an Episcopal priest. At 35, I became an academic. Temple has influenced both sides of my work, the theological, philosophical side and the ethical, political side, and I find him to be characteristically wise on the subject of crisis. He believed that theology must speak to the crisis of its time without fixating on crisis itself. In his early career, Temple wrote books on the side while serving as a pastor. His books refashioned Anglican Logos theology in Hegelian terms. Spirit is the nature of the supreme reality that created all things, a real source and cause of process. The will of Christ is one with the will of God and expressive of it, but not identical with it. Will and personality are ideally interchangeable terms. Love divine creates and calls out from created things the love that all things were created to be and to express. To Temple, Karl Barth was too narrow, confining theology to sola scriptura and a wholly other God, and Karl Marx was too narrow, fixing wholly on capitalist exploitation. Yet Barth and Marx were powerful thinkers who changed how theologians and socialists talked about their subjects. Temple refused to believe that you have to be one-sided to speak with convicting power. Surely, theology should aspire to a comprehensive dialectic that interprets everything. In his later work, Temple fused Hegel, Christian socialism, traditional Logos theology, and Alfred North Whitehead to that end. He appropriated the organic realism of Whitehead as a corrective to the idealist approach of beginning with the mind and its ideas. All apprehension is of objects and is interpretive from the beginning. The mind emerges through the process of apprehensions and adjustments that it apprehends. The fact that the world gives rise to minds that apprehend the world tells us something important about the world. There is a deep kinship between mind and the world. Mind and matter are related dialectically. Temple stressed that matter doesn't generate thought, and thought doesn't generate matter. The relative flux of matter lacks a self-explanatory principle, while mind has the principle of purpose or rational choice. Since there is no materialist explanation for the emergence of mind, and because mind contains a self-explanatory principle of origination, it is reasonable to believe that mind contains the explanation of the world process. If mind is part of nature, nature must be grounded in mind. Otherwise, nature could not contain it. In theological terms, the world has an immanent reason, a logos. If this principle is impersonal, it's a principle of logical coherence. If it is personal, it is purposive, moral, spiritual, and a principle of variation. For personality, whether human or divine, is immersed in the world process at the level of immanent reason. All existence is a medium of revelation, and revelation is the full actuality of the relationship between nature, humanity, and God. Temple was fond of saying that everything is revelatory, but not everything equally reveals the divine character. Revelation is the coincidence of event and appreciation, the apprehension by a mind arising out of the world process of the process for what it is. Divinity self-expressed. Contrary to centuries of church doctrine, revelation is not the communication of doctrine. The church construed it as propositional because Greek and scholastic theologians elevated conceptual thinking above revelatory experience. Temple countered bluntly, there is no such thing as revealed truth. Revelation is like beauty in being revelatory only when apprehended. Temple felt in the 1930s that the world was going to hell. But the answer was not in the redemption theologies propounded by Barth and 13 kinds of neo-orthodoxy. To give up on a theology of manifestation meant that theologies could only speak past and against each other. There had to be a basis for renewing philosophical theology. In his last years, Temple said the same thing about guild socialism. Temple and R.H. Tawney were close friends. They came up together during the heyday of guild socialism, and they refused to relinquish the guild idea altogether after World War II, when the Fabians took over the Labor Party. Guild socialism was a blend of syndicalism, Fabian theory, Christian socialism, Marxism, and medieval guild nostalgia. It incorporated the syndical focus on worker syndicates, but opposed the syndical rhetoric of violent overthrow. It had a role for the state, but rejected the Fabian collectivist state. Guild socialism focused on worker self-determination. The productive life of the nation should be organized by self-governing organizations, embracing all workers in every industry and service. These national guilds would emerge from the unions. The guilds would organize industry, but not own it. They would be owned by the state, which provided the capital, while the goods produced the goods, at least in the dominant version of guild socialism. Anglo-Catholics dominated Christian guild socialism, but there were prominent Roman Catholics in it too, notably Hilaire Belloc and G.K. Chesterton. Guild socialism faded in the 1920s when the Labour Party Fabians stopped funding the guild movement. Sidney Webb wrote the Labour Party Constitution. Its program had 4 planks: full employment and a living wage, common ownership of industry, progressive taxation, and surplus spending for the common good. Clause 4, demanding common ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange, defined the Labour Party for decades. It did not say that socialization means nationalization. Tawney was adamant that Clause 4 could mean guild socialism, worker ownership, municipal ownership, competitive public enterprises, or mixed forms of these models. But nationalization was popular in 1918 and demanded for the coal mines and railways. To Webb, nationalization was the only mode that mattered. In common usage, socialism came to mean nationalization, and to many, it still does, notwithstanding that this usage was already outdated by 1945, and it only really fit the socialist movement in one generation of its history. Tawney and Temple made their peace with the Fabian approach while retaining aspects of guild theory. Tawney wrote the classic works of 20th century British socialism: The Acquisitive Society, Religion and the Rise of Capitalism, and Equality. He argued that all human beings possess God-given equal worth and dignity. Socialism is fundamentally moral and democratic, and freedom and equality go together, for inequality curtails freedom. Equality is the antidote to privilege, which is a function of interrelated social and economic power, and democratizing power is the antidote to tyranny, which is a function of the distribution of power. The goal is for human freedom and fellowship to flourish by democratizing economic and political power. Tawney was a Christian socialist, but he chafed at the label because he was pluralistic about religion and not about socialism. To Tawney, socialism was universal. Everyone should be a socialist. Temple had to say it more gently because he was a bishop, and in 1942 he became Archbishop of Canterbury. In January 1941, Temple convened a conference in Malvern during the worst of the German air raids in England. He said that England had to discuss right now what kind of nation it aspired to be after the war ended. He was incredulous that modern democracies tolerated big private banks. Temple argued that all of them should be turned into utilities or socialized. He lamented that socialists turned away from the land issue in the 1890s. God made the land for everyone, not just those who claim to own it. Society creates the unearned increment in the value of land. Therefore, the increment should go to society. In his book, The Hope of a New World, Temple called for an excess profits tax payable in the form of shares to worker funds. These funds, over time, would gradually gain democratic control over major enterprises. 40 years later, the Swedish Union movement embraced this proposal. It was called the Meidner Plan for Economic Democracy, with no mention of William Temple. In 1982, the Meidner Plan was instituted in Sweden, where it worked perfectly well, except politically. Conservatives and the corporate class railed against it constantly, loathing the very idea of economic democracy, And in 1992, they got rid of it. That is the closest that any nation has come to democratizing economic power on a national scale. Economic democracy is about extending the cooperative sector and extending the values of democracy into the economic system. It builds institutions that don't belong wholly to the capitalist market or the state. Producer and consumer cooperatives, community land trusts, community finance corporations. But merely expanding the cooperative sector is not enough. Cooperatives prohibit non-working shareholders, so they attract less outside financing than capitalist firms. They're committed to keeping low-return firms in operation, so they stay in business even when they can't pay competitive wages. They're committed to particular communities, so they're not as mobile as corporate capital and labor. They smack of anti-capitalist bias, so banks don't like them. They maximize net income per worker rather than profits, so they tend to favor capital-intensive investments over job creation. All these problems are virtues, and the problematic aspects can be mitigated with tax incentives. But we also need forms of social ownership that facilitate democratic capital formation, have a greater capacity for scaling up, and are more entrepreneurial. Public bank models, like the Meidner plan, vest the ownership of productive capital, either through a mutual funded holding company or an outright public bank. The holding companies lend capital to enterprises at market rates of interest and otherwise control the process of investment. Equity shareholders, the state, and or other cooperatives own the holding companies or public banks. This model contains a built-in system of wage restraints, and it facilitates new forms of capital formation. It has nothing to do with nationalization, and investors still seek the highest rate of return. It does not rest on idealistic notions about human nature, and it doesn't need a blueprint. Had the Meidner plan been allowed to run past 1992 in Sweden, it would have crossed the line from social democracy into democratic socialism. But even in Sweden, the guardians of neoliberal capitalism did not tolerate transitions to a different kind of system. The public bank model is more market savvy than traditional cooperatives and government ownership. Always there are trade-offs to negotiate concerning how much supervisory control to grant the holding companies. The investment agencies diminish democratic worker control, and they make stringent demands on fund managers to play a competitive game on behalf of the common good. But trade-offs of this kind are inherent in the attempt to make democratic socialist values work within capitalist markets and capitalist societies. Yardstick public corporations are another alternative to nationalizing entire industries. A publicly owned bank, or pharmaceutical manufacturer, or health insurance company, or auto company can measure what the market actually requires in industries that tend to become oligopolies. In 2009, when the government bailed out the mega banks buried in toxic debt in the USA, the case for establishing a public bank that funds green jobs was very strong. But the incoming Obama administration preferred to cooperate with the mega bank oligarchy, as it put it. At the same time, a plank establishing a public option in healthcare was included in the original Affordable Care Act. It passed the House of Representatives and was supported by a majority in the Senate. The public option would have competed with private plans in national or regional purchasing pools. It would have been, and still is, a glide path to Medicare for all. Healthcare is a fundamental human right that should be available to all people, regardless of their economic resources. A decent society does not relegate the poor to second-class status. When middle-class people have to rely on the same healthcare system as the poor, they use their political power to make sure it's a good system. The public option was the acid test of whether Obamacare was going to structurally reform the system or just make the insurance companies take more customers. Had citizens been allowed to choose a government plan, they would have done so, which could have led to a universal Medicare with everybody in and nobody out. As it was, the president bailed out from the fight to defeat a Senate filibuster, and the cause of structural reform was lost. Bernie Sanders, the only senator to call for Medicare for all in 2009, swung the left wing of the Democratic Party in his direction afterward, believing that the moment for the glide path had passed. But establishing a public option, or a public bank, or a public pharmaceutical company would still be a major breakthrough for economic democracy in the USA. The crisis of 9/11 was wasted, propelling the US into perpetual imperial wars. The financial crash of 2008 was mostly wasted too, allowing the mega banks to just become bigger than ever. The current crisis will be wasted if we don't gain control of the forces driving severe inequality and the eco-crisis and yet another backlash of anti-Black racism. White supremacy is a structure of power based on privilege that presumes to define what is normal. White culture is transparent to white persons wherever they're dominant. It's hard to see because it's everything that's not specifically African American culture, Latinx culture, and so on. If you live in this society without being constantly reminded of your race, and you don't have to worry about representing your race, and you can worry about racism without being viewed as self-interested, and you don't have to worry about being targeted by police because of your race, you are a beneficiary of it. What is saving is for white people to relinquish the privileges of whiteness, and for all people to love Blackness. The work of recent years in religious communities, in interfaith community organizing, in schools, in civic organizations, and the media is beginning to pay off. Look at the colossal protest demonstrations that occurred after George Floyd was cut down. We have never seen anywhere near this many white people willing to put themselves out there. And that's in the middle of a pandemic. It may be that Trump will benefit in November from the protests against racism. Nobody knows how that will play out. But there is such a thing as doing what is right. This is a moment to put everything on the line. For those of us who belong to a faith tradition, having a religious faith keeps us in the struggle for social justice. In Hebrew and Christian scripture, the test of ethical action is how it affects the struggles of oppressed and excluded people. We need forms of community that forge ties of solidarity and that abolish racism, sexism, and the denigration of gay, lesbian, trans, and queer persons. I am for anything that helps us renew our institutions for a global, interdependent, interfaith world. And for that, we need to refashion the best of our theological traditions.